It was New Year's Eve, 2018, and my friends and I had rented a secluded lodge in the forests of upstate New York. It was meant to be a relaxing escape from our hectic lives, a chance to disconnect and spend quality time together before diving into another year of work, stress, and chaos. The lodge was perfect, a sprawling wooden cabin surrounded by snow-covered pines, with no neighbors for miles. There were 6 of us, me, my boyfriend Daniel, our friends Olivia and Josh, and another couple, Mia and Ethan. We'd packed enough food and booze to last the weekend, along with board games and movies to keep us entertained. The lodge was cozy, with a huge stone fireplace, warm wooden interiors, and large windows that looked out onto the endless forest. But by midnight, the lodge wouldn't feel cozy at all. It would feel like a trap. The first strange thing happened as we were unpacking. Mia and Ethan were in the kitchen putting away groceries, while the rest of us were unloading the car. I was carrying a box of supplies up to the porch when Olivia stopped suddenly, her eyes fixed on the woods. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice low. I followed her gaze but saw nothing but trees. "See what?" She hesitated. "I thought I saw someone. Just for a second, between the trees." Josh laughed, brushing it off. "Probably a deer or something. This place is crawling with wildlife." Olivia didn't look convinced, but she shrugged and followed us inside. The evening started off great. We cooked a big dinner, played charades by the fire, and drank way too much wine. The storm that had been forecasted earlier began around 9 p.m., blanketing the lodge in snow and cutting us off completely from the outside world. We didn't mind. In fact, it made the night feel even more magical. But as the hours ticked by, the atmosphere began to shift. It started with a noise. We were gathered in the living room, laughing over a ridiculous game of Pictionary, when we heard it, a faint tapping sound, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "What was that?" Mia asked, looking toward the front door. "Probably just the wind," Daniel said. "This place is old. It's bound to make weird noises." But the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, coming from somewhere near the windows. I got up to check, pulling back the heavy curtains. There was nothing there. By 10:30, the tapping had stopped, but the unease lingered. Olivia kept glancing toward the windows, her face pale and tense. Josh tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but it was clear no one was in the mood to laugh anymore. Then, the lights went out. The sudden darkness plunged the room into chaos. Mia let out a small scream, and Ethan cursed as he tripped over a chair. Daniel fumbled with his phone, turning on the flashlight as we tried to make sense of what had happened. "The storm must have knocked out the power," Ethan said, his voice shaky. "Great," Olivia muttered. "No lights, no heat. What else could go wrong?" We gathered candles and flashlights from the kitchen, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. The lodge felt different now, colder, quieter, like something was watching us from the dark corners. Josh and I volunteered to check the fuse box, which was located in a small shed behind the lodge. Armed with flashlights and a bottle of whiskey for courage, we trudged through the snow, the wind howling around us. The shed was old, its wooden walls warped and splintered. Inside, the fuse box looked ancient, but everything seemed to be in working order. "No blown fuses," Josh said, shining his flashlight over the switches. "That's weird." We were about to head back when I noticed something on the wall, a row of deep, jagged scratches, as if something with claws had raked through the wood. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. Josh didn't argue. When we got back to the lodge, the others were waiting anxiously by the fire. "Well?" Olivia asked. "Everything looked fine," Josh said. "It's probably just the storm. Nothing to worry about." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The scratches on the shed wall, the tapping at the windows, the way the lodge seemed to grow colder with every passing minute, it all felt connected. And then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and crunching through the snow just outside the lodge. We all froze, the blood draining from our faces. The footsteps moved around the building, pausing occasionally before continuing. They were too heavy to be an animal, too deliberate to be the wind. "Is someone out there?" Daniel whispered. No one answered. We huddled together in the living room, the fire casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then came the knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it sent a wave of terror through all of us. The knock came again, louder this time, and then a third time, harder still. Ethan grabbed a poker from the fireplace, his hands trembling. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. No answer. Just the sound of the wind outside. Summoning what little courage we had left, we opened the door. The snowstorm swirled around us, the wind biting at our skin, but there was no one there. The porch was empty, the snow untouched except for a single set of footprints leading from the woods. The prints stopped abruptly at the edge of the porch. By midnight, the lodge felt like a prison. We barricaded the doors and windows, piling furniture against them in a desperate attempt to feel safe. The footsteps returned, circling the lodge, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all we could hear. Words we didn't understand, spoken in a voice that sounded impossibly far away yet right next to us. And then, as the clock struck midnight, everything stopped. The whispers, the footsteps, the wind, it all vanished, leaving the lodge in an oppressive silence. We waited, too afraid to move, until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. When we stepped outside, the snow was pristine. No footprints, no scratches, no sign that anything had happened. But we knew what we'd experienced was real. None of us ever spoke about that night again. We left the lodge that morning and never returned. But every New Year's Eve, when the wind howls and the world grows quiet, I hear it again, the knock at the door, the whispers in the dark. And I know it's not over. New Year's Eve, 2020, wasn't supposed to be anything special. I had recently moved to a small town in Montana for work, and I didn't know many people yet. My plans were simple: light a fire in my tiny rental cabin, crack open a bottle of wine, and wait for midnight in solitude. It wasn't glamorous, but after the chaos of the past year, I was content with the quiet. The cabin was cozy, tucked into the edge of the woods on a stretch of isolated land. My landlord had built it years ago as a getaway spot, and it showed its age in the creaky floorboards and drafty windows. Still, it had a charm that made it feel safe, even with the snowstorm rolling in that evening. But by midnight, the safety I'd felt would turn into something far darker. It started innocently enough. Around 7 p.m., I had the fire roaring, the lights dimmed, and a soft snowfall outside creating the perfect wintry scene. I'd just settled into my armchair with a blanket and my wine when a knock at the door startled me. The cabin was so remote that I hadn't expected any visitors. My nearest neighbor lived half a mile down the road, and they were an older couple who rarely ventured out after dark. Curious but wary, I approached the door and peeked through the window. A man stood on the porch, bundled in a heavy coat and scarf. Snow clung to his shoulders, and he had his hands stuffed into his pockets. His face was shadowed under the brim of his hat, but I could see the faint cloud of his breath in the cold air. "Who is it?" I called out, keeping the door firmly closed. "My car broke down," he replied, his voice muffled but calm. "I saw the light from your fire and hoped you might have a phone I could use." I hesitated. The storm outside was picking up, and the man's story seemed plausible. Still, something about his presence unsettled me. Maybe it was the way he stood so still, or the faint unease that prickled at the back of my neck. But I wasn't going to leave him out in the cold. I unlocked the door and cracked it open, just enough to let him step inside. The warmth hit him immediately, and he sighed with visible relief as he pulled off his scarf. His face was pale, his cheeks reddened from the cold. He looked to be in his early 40s, with sharp features and dark, piercing eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room. "Thank you," he said, his tone polite but distant. "I really appreciate it." "No problem," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. "The storm's getting bad out there." "Where's your car?" "Just down the road," he said. "Slid into a ditch." I didn't see it coming in this weather. I nodded, though something about his words didn't sit right. The road to the cabin was narrow, winding, and completely covered in snow. If he'd driven off it, I would have heard the crash, or at least seen the tracks. I handed him my phone, and he pretended to make a call, his voice low and indistinct. When he handed it back, he gave me a tight smile. "No signal," he said. "Figures, out here." I didn't point out that I'd had full bars earlier. Instead, I offered him a seat by the fire, and he took it without hesitation. For a while, we sat in awkward silence, the only sound the crackling of the flames and the wind howling outside. As the minutes stretched on, my unease grew. The men didn't seem in a hurry to leave, and every time I glanced at him, I caught him watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His eyes lingered too long on the photos on the mantel, the books on the shelf, the locked door to the bedroom. "So, what brings you out this way?" I asked, trying to break the tension. "Just passing through," he replied, his tone flat. "Looking for somewhere quiet to spend the holiday." His answer didn't make sense. Who drives to the middle of nowhere on New Year's Eve without a plan? But before I could press further, the fire flickered, and the lights dimmed. The power went out. The room was plunged into near darkness, the glow of the fire the only light. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the gloom. The men didn't seem fazed by the outage. In fact, he almost seemed to relax, sinking deeper into the chair as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "You should check the breaker," he said, his voice calm and steady. I hesitated. The breaker box was in the basement, and the thought of leaving him alone upstairs sent a wave of unease through me. But the alternative was sitting in the dark with a stranger whose presence felt more sinister by the second. "I'll be right back," I said, my voice tight. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen before heading to the basement, slipping it into my pocket. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the air grew colder with each step. The flashlight beam trembled as I scanned the dimly lit space, the shadows dancing along the walls. The breaker box was untouched. All the switches were in place, and there was no sign of a tripped circuit. But as I turned to head back upstairs, I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and coming from above me. My stomach dropped as I realized the man wasn't sitting by the fire anymore. He was moving, walking through the cabin, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. I killed the flashlight and crept toward the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The firelight cast long shadows across the ceiling, and I could just make out his silhouette moving from room to room. He was looking for something. When he reached the kitchen, I saw my chance. I bolted up the stairs, knife in hand, and slammed the basement door shut. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. "You should have stayed downstairs," he said softly. The words sent a jolt of fear through me, and I backed away, the knife trembling in my hand. But he didn't move toward me. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. A key. I didn't recognize it, but the way he held it made my blood run cold. "You locked the door," he said, his tone almost amused. "But this place, it's mine now." I lunged toward the front door, yanking it open and stumbling into the snow. The wind whipped against my face as I sprinted toward the woods, the darkness swallowing me whole. I didn't stop until I was deep among the trees, the sound of my own ragged breathing drowning out the storm. When I finally dared to look back, the cabin was dark. But in the window, illuminated by the faint glow of the dying fire, I saw him standing there, watching me. I never went back to that cabin. The landlord called me a few days later to say the place had been ransacked, furniture overturned, windows shattered. But there was no sign of the man, or the key, or whatever he'd been looking for. Every New Year's Eve, I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the next stranger to open their door. It was New Year's Eve, 2021, and my friends and I decided to ring in the new year at a remote cabin deep in the Colorado Rockies. It belonged to James' uncle, who generously offered it to us for the long weekend. The cabin was tucked away at the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by towering evergreens blanketed in fresh snow. It sounded idyllic, a chance to get away from the noise of the city and celebrate in nature. The five of us, James, Sarah, Emma, Max, and me, arrived mid-afternoon as the sun dipped low over the horizon. The air was crisp, the sky a pale shade of blue that hinted at the storm predicted for later that night. We were all in good spirits, joking and unpacking the car. Inside the cabin, the rustic charm was undeniable. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, and antlers mounted on the walls gave the place an old-fashioned wilderness vibe. As we settled in, none of us could have imagined how wrong the night would turn. The first hint of unease came just after dinner. We were playing cards by the fire, the warmth seeping into our bones as laughter filled the air. Max went to get more wood from the shed outside, but when he returned, his face was pale. "Did one of you mess with the snowman?" he asked, his voice shaky. We exchanged confused glances. "What snowman?" Sarah asked. Max hesitated. "There's a snowman outside the cabin. Right in the middle of the yard. I swear it wasn't there when we got here." We all grabbed our coats and followed Max outside. Sure enough, there it was, a tall snowman, its body lumpy and uneven, with sticks for arms and a crooked carrot nose. Small black stones formed its mouth and eyes, giving it a grin that felt more menacing than cheerful. "Maybe a neighbor built it," James offered, though the nearest neighbor was miles away. "Yeah, sure," Max muttered, kicking snow toward the base of the snowman. "Weird, but whatever." We shrugged it off and went back inside, chalking it up to some strange coincidence. But the tension lingered. The storm had started, snow piling against the windows, and the wind howled like a living thing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. By 9 p.m., the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the fireplace. We lit a few candles and tried to keep the mood light, but it was clear everyone was on edge. The snowstorm raged outside, the wind rattling the windows as if demanding to be let in. It was around this time that Sarah noticed the footprints. She had gone to the kitchen to grab a drink and returned looking uneasy. "There are footprints," she said, her voice trembling. "In the snow, leading around the cabin." James grabbed a flashlight, and we all huddled by the window. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a trail of footprints leading from the woods to the cabin, and then circling it. "Maybe it's an animal," Emma suggested weakly. "An animal doesn't wear boots," James replied, his voice grim. The laughter and jokes had evaporated by then. We locked all the doors and windows, bolting the shutters and making sure the fire was stoked. But no one said what we were all thinking: someone, or something, was out there. At 11 p.m., the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost polite, a gentle tap-tap-tap at the front door. We froze, staring at each other, too scared to move. "Who's out there?" James called, his voice shaking. No answer. Just another knock. Finally, James grabbed a fire poker and crept toward the door. "Stay back," he whispered to the rest of us. He yanked the door open, but the porch was empty. The snowstorm swirled outside, and the footprints had been erased by the fresh snow. We shut the door and huddled by the fire, our nerves frayed. None of us wanted to admit how scared we were, but the tension was palpable. The storm seemed to intensify, the wind howling louder, the cabin creaking as if under immense pressure. At 11:30, the snowman returned. Sarah was the first to see it. She screamed, pointing out the window. We all turned, our breath catching in our throats. The snowman was standing right outside the window, its crooked grin pressed against the glass. But it wasn't just the snowman that terrified us, it was what was inside it. Beneath the layers of snow, we could see something moving. Shadows shifted within the snowman's body, dark and pulsating. The stones that formed its mouth twitched, curling into an even wider grin. "What the hell is that?" Max whispered, his voice barely audible. We backed away from the window, our fear reaching a fever pitch. The knocking started again, this time louder, more insistent. It came from all around the cabin, first the front door, then the back, then the windows. It was everywhere at once. At 11:45, we decided to make a run for it. The storm had eased slightly, and we thought if we could just get to the car, we could drive away from whatever was happening. James grabbed the keys, and we threw on our coats, preparing for the freezing dash. But when we opened the door, the snowman was standing there, blocking our path. Its grin was wider now, impossibly wide, stretching across its entire face. The shadows inside it writhed, and its stick arms twitched as if reaching for us. We slammed the door shut and bolted it, our panic turning into full-blown terror. "We're trapped," Emma said, her voice cracking. The last 15 minutes of the year felt like an eternity. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, shaking the walls of the cabin. The fire sputtered and died, plunging us into darkness. We huddled together, clutching whatever makeshift weapons we could find. As the clock struck midnight, the knocking stopped. The silence was deafening. We waited, holding our breath, but there was nothing, no wind, no knocking, no movement. Slowly, James opened the door. The snowman was gone. The storm had erased all traces of what had happened. The snow was smooth and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. We packed our things and left the cabin at first light, not daring to stay a moment longer. To this day, none of us can explain what we saw. But every New Year's Eve, I hear it in my dreams, the sound of that knocking, and the sight of that snowman's twisted grin. Waiting. New Year's Eve, 2015, was supposed to be a simple, quiet night for me. My parents had gone on a cruise to celebrate the holidays, leaving me to take care of our small family farm in northern Wisconsin. I didn't mind, it was peaceful, and I liked having the place to myself. The farm was surrounded by dense woods, with the nearest neighbor a good half-mile down the road. Snow had been falling steadily all day, blanketing the fields in white. The old farmhouse creaked under the weight of the storm, the wind rattling the windows. It was cozy, in a way. I had a fire going, a pot of chili simmering on the stove, and a couple of movies lined up to pass the time until midnight. But by the end of the night, the silence I loved so much would turn into something I'll never forget. It began just after 8 p.m. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a loud thud outside. It wasn't unusual for snow to slide off the roof or for branches to fall in a storm, but this sounded heavier, deliberate. I set my phone down and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the yard blanketed in snow and the faint outline of the barn in the distance. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. A shadow darting between the trees at the edge of the property. I froze, my breath fogging up the glass. The shadow disappeared, and the yard was still again. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself, though the thought did little to calm my nerves. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, reassuring myself that everything was secure. The storm outside grew louder, the wind howling like a living thing. I returned to the couch, but the unease lingered. By 9 p.m., the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, the comforting hum of the heater replaced by an eerie silence. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, its beam casting long shadows across the walls. The fire in the living room still crackled, providing some light and warmth, but the house suddenly felt colder. I tried to tell myself it was just the storm, but then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, coming from the back door. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, as if someone, or something, was knocking just hard enough to be heard over the storm. My heart raced as I crept toward the door, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The tapping stopped just as I reached the window beside the door. I pulled the curtain aside and shone the flashlight into the darkness. The beam illuminated the snow-covered porch, but it was empty. No footprints, no sign of anyone. Just the swirling snow and the black void of the woods beyond. I locked the door and backed away, my stomach twisting with unease. An hour later, it happened again. This time, the sound came from the front porch. The knock was louder, more insistent, and my nerves were stretched thin as I approached the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I debated whether to open the door, but something in my gut screamed at me not to. Instead, I moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. My breath caught in my throat. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, barely visible through the falling snow. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. It didn't move, didn't seem to react to the light from the window. It just stood there, watching. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I looked again, the figure was gone. I locked myself in the living room, barricading the doors with chairs and whatever heavy furniture I could find. The fire cast flickering shadows across the walls, making the room feel smaller, more oppressive. I clutched the flashlight like a weapon, my ears straining for any sound beyond the crackle of the flames. By 11:30, the tapping had started again. This time, it came from the windows, soft and deliberate, moving from one pane to the next as if testing each one. The sound was maddening, echoing in my head as I sat frozen in fear. And then, the voice came. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder, more distinct. A low, guttural sound, speaking words I couldn't understand. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the room and drowning out the sound of the storm. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder. The tapping turned into banging, the windows shaking in their frames as the voice rose to a deafening roar. "Come outside," it said, the words clear now, cutting through the noise like a blade. I screamed, the sound lost in the chaos. The fire sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The banging stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. When I dared to open my eyes, the room was empty. The fire had gone out, the shadows no longer dancing on the walls. But outside the window, I saw them. Figures. There were 3 of them now, standing in the yard. They were tall and thin, their faces pale and featureless, their heads tilted as if observing me. The snow swirled around them, but they remained still, unmoving. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the back door, adrenaline overpowering my fear. The snow was deep, slowing me down as I stumbled toward my truck. The figures didn't follow, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching as I fumbled with the door. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the driveway, the tires skidding on the icy road. I didn't look back. When I reached the main road, I finally dared to glance in the rearview mirror. The farmhouse was a distant silhouette, the figures standing on the porch like shadows etched into the snow. I never went back. My parents returned from their trip a few days later, finding the house just as I'd left it. They thought I was being paranoid, blaming the storm and my imagination. But every New Year's Eve, I dream of the tapping on the windows, the voice calling me outside. And I wonder what would have happened if I had answered. It was New Year's Eve, 2019, and I was spending it at my family's cabin near Lake Hartwell in South Carolina. My parents had bought the place years ago as a summer retreat, but we rarely used it in the winter. This year, though, I needed the solitude. My girlfriend and I had just broken up, and I wanted to ring in the new year away from everyone and everything. The lake was eerily beautiful in the winter, its calm surface reflecting the pale moonlight. The cabin itself was small but cozy, with a wood-burning stove and big windows that looked out over the water. The nearest neighbor was more than a mile away, and with the snowstorm rolling in, it felt like I was the only person in the world. By midnight, I would wish I had never gone there. The first strange thing happened around 9 p.m. I had been sitting by the fire, sipping on a whiskey and reading an old paperback, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Through the window, over the frozen surface of the lake, a faint light was flickering. I set the book down and walked to the window, squinting into the darkness. The light was far out, near the middle of the lake, swaying gently as if carried by someone walking. But that didn't make sense. The ice was too thin to support a person, and besides, who would be out there in this weather? I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, the cold air biting at my face. The light on the lake flickered again, brighter this time, before disappearing completely. I stood there for a moment, scanning the dark expanse, but there was nothing, just the wind howling through the trees and the faint creak of the ice shifting on the water. I told myself it was probably just a reflection, maybe from a distant car or a house across the lake. But as I went back inside, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. By 10 p.m., the storm had picked up. Snow was falling steadily, the wind rattling the windows, and the cabin felt colder despite the roaring fire. I had just poured myself another drink when the power went out. The sudden darkness was jarring. I fumbled for my flashlight, its weak beam barely illuminating the room. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. I tried to convince myself it was just the storm, that the outage was normal for a place like this. But then I heard it. A faint tapping sound, coming from the back door. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone knocking softly but insistently. My stomach tightened as I crept toward the door, the flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hello." I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped. I peered out the window beside the door, but the porch was empty. The snow outside was undisturbed, no footprints leading up to the cabin. My breath fogged up the glass as I stared into the darkness, straining to see anything beyond the swirling snow. And then the tapping started again, this time at the front door. My heart was pounding now as I moved to the other side of the cabin. The front porch was also empty, the snow pristine. I locked the door and backed away, my mind racing. Was someone messing with me? A prank? A neighbor I didn't know about? But I knew, deep down, that wasn't the case. At 11 p.m., the light on the lake returned. I noticed it as I passed by the window, a faint glow bobbing on the water. This time, it was closer, just a few hundred feet from the shore. It swayed gently, like a lantern held by an invisible hand. I couldn't take my eyes off it. It seemed to pulse faintly, drawing me in, and before I knew it, I was pulling on my coat and boots. The wind was fierce as I stepped outside, the snow stinging my face. The light on the lake flickered but remained steady, as if waiting for me. I walked down to the edge of the water, the snow crunching under my boots. The lake was frozen, the ice creaking beneath the weight of the storm. I stopped at the shoreline, my breath visible in the freezing air. The light was closer now, no more than 50 feet away, hovering just above the ice. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the wind. The light didn't respond. Something about it was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. I took a cautious step onto the ice, then another, the surface groaning beneath me. The light seemed to retreat slightly, as if leading me forward. I stopped, the rational part of my brain screaming at me to turn back. But before I could move, the light went out. The darkness was absolute. I turned back toward the cabin, but I couldn't see it through the storm. Panic set in as I realized how far I'd wandered onto the ice. The wind howled around me, and the cold seeped into my bones. Then, in the silence, I heard it. A faint whisper. It was coming from beneath the ice. I froze, my breath hitching as I listened. The whisper was soft, almost melodic, but I couldn't make out the words. I dropped to my knees, shining the flashlight onto the ice. Beneath the surface, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, dark and formless, gliding beneath the ice. But as it came closer, I could see it more clearly. A face. Pale and distorted, its eyes wide and unblinking, staring up at me. I scrambled back, the ice cracking under my weight. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, echoing in my head like a voice I couldn't escape. "Come closer," it seemed to say. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, the ice splintering beneath my boots as I stumbled toward the shore. The whisper followed me, growing louder with every step, until I finally collapsed onto solid ground. When I looked back, the light was gone. The lake was still, its surface unbroken, as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, clutching the flashlight and watching the windows, half expecting the light to reappear. But the lake remained dark, and the storm began to ease as dawn approached. When I finally stepped outside, the snow had covered my tracks, erasing any sign of what had happened. But the memory of that face beneath the ice still haunts me. I never went back to the cabin. My family sold it the following year, and I didn't argue. But every New Year's Eve, when the world feels quiet and the air grows cold, I remember the whispers. And I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for someone else to follow the light. New Year's Eve, 2016, was supposed to be a quiet night. I was working the night shift at a small railway station in rural Ohio, a job that I had taken to pay the bills while finishing up school. The station was barely used anymore, just a stop on the way for freight trains and the occasional late-night commuter. Most nights, I saw no one at all, and I liked it that way. The station was small, with a ticket counter, a waiting area, and a single platform overlooking the empty tracks. Outside, the snow had been falling steadily since sunset, the white blanket making the already quiet surroundings feel eerily still. I had planned to spend the shift catching up on a book, maybe sipping on the hot chocolate I'd packed. But as the hours ticked by, I realized this New Year's Eve wasn't going to be like any other. It started with the lights. Around 10 p.m., the overhead fluorescence began to flicker. At first, it was subtle, just a brief dimming that made me glance up from my book. But as the minutes passed, the flickering grew worse, until the lights went out completely, plunging the station into darkness. I sighed, grabbing the flashlight from under the counter. Power outages weren't uncommon in storms like this, and the backup generator would usually kick in within a few minutes. But as I waited, I realized something was off. The station was too quiet. No hum of the heaters, no creak of the old building settling. Just silence. And then, I heard it. A faint whistle, carried on the cold wind. I froze, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. The schedule for the night was clear, no trains were due to pass through until morning. Yet the whistle was unmistakable, growing louder with each passing second. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside onto the platform. The snow was still falling, muffling everything except the distant sound of the approaching train. The track stretched out into the darkness, empty and unbroken. But then, through the swirling snow, I saw it. The train appeared out of nowhere, its headlights cutting through the storm like twin beacons. It was an old-fashioned locomotive, the kind you'd see in black and white photographs. Steam billowed from the engine, and its wheels screeched against the tracks as it slowed to a stop in front of the platform. I stood frozen, my breath fogging in the icy air. The train was silent now, its windows dark, its doors closed. No one got off. No one got on. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The train didn't respond. I hesitated before stepping closer, the snow crunching under my boots. The train was enormous up close, its black metal exterior gleaming faintly in the dim light of my flashlight. My reflection stared back at me from the dark windows, distorted and pale. Then, one of the doors slid open. A wave of cold air hit me, colder than the snowstorm outside. It carried with it a faint, metallic smell that made my stomach twist. I shone the flashlight inside, but the beam was swallowed by the darkness. "Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The train didn't answer. I should have walked away. I should have gone back inside, locked the doors, and pretended I hadn't seen anything. But something compelled me to step onto the train, as if an invisible hand were guiding me forward. The door slid shut behind me with a heavy thud, sealing me inside. The interior of the train was nothing like I'd expected. The walls were lined with faded velvet, and the seats were worn and frayed, as if the train had been abandoned for decades. A faint, flickering light cast long shadows across the floor, and the air was thick with the scent of rust and decay. I walked down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The train felt alive, the walls seeming to breathe with every creak and groan. I glanced into one of the compartments and froze. A figure sat in the seat, their face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, but I could feel their presence like a weight in the air. "Excuse me," I said, my voice trembling. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't respond. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. As I turned to leave, I saw another figure in the next compartment, and another in the one after that. Each one was seated, motionless, their faces obscured by shadows or clothing. Panic surged through me as I stumbled back toward the door. But when I reached it, it wouldn't open. The handle was ice cold, refusing to budge no matter how hard I pulled. The train began to move. The jolt sent me crashing to the floor, my flashlight clattering out of my hand. I scrambled to my feet, the world outside the windows a blur of white as the train picked up speed. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my cries were swallowed by the sound of the wheels screeching against the tracks. Then, I heard it, a low, guttural whisper, coming from the darkness behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The figures in the compartments were standing now, their heads tilted unnaturally, their hands pressed against the glass. Their eyes were black pits, staring straight at me. I stumbled backward, my mind racing as the whispers grew louder, filling the train with a cacophony of voices. They weren't speaking any language I recognized, but the tone was unmistakable: anger, desperation, hunger. The lights flickered, and the figures were suddenly closer. They stood in the aisle now, their faces still hidden, their bodies swaying as if caught in an unseen current. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Let me out!" I screamed, pounding on the door. The train didn't stop. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, the figures closing in, their movements jerky and unnatural. I fell to the floor, covering my ears as the air grew colder, the darkness pressing in around me. And then, everything stopped. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the platform, the snow falling gently around me. The train was gone, the tracks empty and silent. My flashlight was still clutched in my hand, its beam flickering weakly. I stumbled back into the station, locking the doors behind me. The lights were back on, the power humming softly, as if nothing had happened. But the clock on the wall told a different story. It was 12:01 a.m. The train wasn't on the schedule. It didn't exist in any records. But every New Year's Eve, I hear it again, the faint whistle in the distance, the screech of wheels on the tracks. And I know it's coming for me.